It was 2:17 a.m. when the frantic knocking shattered the silence. At first I thought it was the wind. Portland nights could be cruel, the rain often whispering secrets through the cracks of my old porch. But the pounding grew louder, desperate, like someone begging the night itself for mercy. Then I heard a trembling voice that froze my blood. "Grandma, it's me, Ethan. 3 years. 3 long, hollow years since I'd last seen my grandson's face." I stumbled toward the door, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. When I opened it, the boy standing there was a shadow of the bright, curious child who once ran through my garden with laughter spilling like sunlight. His jacket was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his small hands scraped raw. He was shaking so violently that I thought he might collapse. And before I could ask anything, he whispered words that made my fingers go numb and the phone slip from my grasp. "Grandma," he said, his voice barely a breath. "My stepdad did something you can't even imagine." Rain drummed on the roof as I pulled him inside, wrapping him in the old quilt from the couch. His body was cold, the kind of cold that comes not just from the night but from fear. I pressed my hand against his cheek, damp, pale, trembling. "You're safe now," I whispered. "You're with Grandma." But Ethan didn't look at me. His eyes darted toward the window, watching the street beyond the glass as though monsters might rise from the darkness. I led him to the sofa, turned on the small lamp by the fireplace, and the dim yellow light revealed what 3 years had stolen. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness. He still clutched his old stuffed bear Barnaby, the one I'd given him when he was 5. I remembered patching its ear once after he'd cried because the stuffing had spilled. He used to giggle when I told him that Barnaby had a brave heart just like his. Now that same bear looked like a relic from a forgotten life. "Ethan," I said softly, kneeling in front of him, "tell me what happened." He didn't answer. His lips pressed into a hard line. He was wet to the bone, so I fetched a towel and started drying his hair. Each stroke of my hand only made me notice more the faint bruises at the edge of his collar, the way he flinched when I touched his shoulder. I forced myself to stay calm, but inside my stomach twisted into knots. "I can make you some warm milk," I said, trying to sound steady. "You must be freezing." He only nodded faintly, whispering, "Don't turn on the lights too bright, he might see." Those words hit me like a chill wind through a cracked window. He. I didn't have to ask who he meant. Gregory. My daughter Rachel's new husband, the man who had managed to erase me from their lives 3 years ago. As I warmed the milk on the stove, my mind wandered back to that day, the last time I saw Ethan before tonight. The argument with Rachel had been sharp and painful, her voice full of anger, mine full of fear. Gregory stood behind her, quiet but present, his arm resting on her shoulder like a claim. He had smiled at me with that same unnerving calm that now haunted my thoughts. "You should rest more, Mrs. Moore," he'd said then. "You worry too much." And after that day, they never came back. My calls went unanswered, my letters returned. The last photo I had of Ethan was from his 7th birthday, his grin wide and innocent, cake frosting on his cheek. The kettle whistled, snapping me back. I poured the milk, added honey like I used to, and handed it to him. "Here you go, sweetheart." He took it with both hands, sipping slowly, eyes never leaving the window. "You're safe here," I said again, sitting beside him. "No one can hurt you." He shook his head. "He'll find me, Grandma. He always does." The way he said it, the quiet certainty, made my throat tighten. I tried to change the subject, to give his little mind a moment of rest. "You've grown taller," I said softly. "Do you still like space books?" He glanced at me for the first time that night. "Mom threw them away," he murmured. The words fell heavy between us, the kind of weight that crushed more than silence. I tucked the quilt around him tighter and watched the clock tick toward 3. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft but relentless. The house, once so empty, now breathed again, but the warmth was laced with dread. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind felt like a threat waiting to knock again. "Where's your mom, Ethan?" I finally asked. He hesitated, clutching Barnaby closer. "She doesn't know I'm here." I swallowed hard. "You came alone," he nodded. "I climbed out the window after they went to sleep." "Why, sweetheart, what happened?" He stared down at the cup, the steam fogging his face. "He hurt someone." The words froze me. Who? I whispered. Ethan's lips trembled. I don't know. He said I'd never see her again if I told anyone. I wanted to ask more, but the sheer terror in his eyes stopped me. Whatever he'd seen was too big, too dark for a 10-year-old boy. I brushed his hair back gently and forced my voice to steady. You're safe now, I promise. He nodded weakly but didn't believe it, not yet. His gaze drifted to the old family photo on the wall, the one with Rachel, my late son-in-law, Alex and Ethan as a toddler laughing on his father's shoulders. He looked at it so long that I wondered what he was remembering or what he missed most. The clock struck 3. I guided him toward the guest room, his old room, where the sheets still smelled faintly of lavender. He hesitated at the door. Can I sleep next to you, Grandma? Of course. We lay side by side on my bed, the old wooden frame creaking softly. His small hand found mine under the blanket. I could feel how fast his heart was racing. I stroked his hair until his breathing slowed, until the tremors in his shoulders eased. But I couldn't close my eyes. My mind was racing, Gregory's calm face, Rachel's anger, Ethan's whispered words. He hurt someone. The phrase repeated itself louder each time, like a heartbeat echoing in my ears. Just before dawn, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The storm outside had quieted, but inside me a different one was just beginning. When I opened my eyes again, the faint light of morning slipped through the blinds, casting soft gold across the floor. For a fleeting second, the world seemed peaceful. Then I noticed Ethan standing by the window, still clutching Barnaby, staring at something outside. What is it, sweetheart? I asked. He turned slowly, his face pale. A car, he said quietly. It's his car. My heart clenched. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek. Down the street in the early mist, a dark SUV idled with its headlights off. I froze. Come away from the window, I whispered, pulling Ethan close. Don't move. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I could, the car slowly backed up and disappeared into the fog. Ethan buried his face in my chest, whispering, "He's going to come for me." I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the smallness of his body against mine. "He'll have to go through me first," I said, though my voice trembled. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, staring at it, torn between a mother's instinct and a grandmother's fear. Ethan grabbed my hand. "Please," he begged, eyes wide, "don't tell them I'm here." The buzzing stopped, leaving the room in heavy silence. Outside, a stray crow cawed, breaking the stillness. I sat there holding him, realizing that whatever nightmare had driven this child to my door was far from over, and that the truth waiting behind it might be darker than I was ready to face. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, painting faint lines across the living room floor. I sat in the old armchair, my hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee I had forgotten to drink. Ethan was still asleep on the couch, curled under the quilt like a small, fragile secret. For the first time in 3 years, the house wasn't silent yet. My chest felt heavier than it ever had. Watching him breathe softly, I couldn't stop thinking about the last day I had seen that face before I was banned from seeing him at all. 3 years of silence. 3 years of being told I was too meddlesome, too emotional, too attached. I thought I had learned to live with the emptiness, but now, looking at him again, every buried memory clawed its way back. It had started on Ethan's 7th birthday. The house had been filled with balloons and laughter. I'd baked his favorite chocolate cake, and Rachel, my only daughter, had smiled when she walked in with her new husband, Gregory Hall. It was the first time I'd met him in person. He was handsome, charming, his smile measured like a man who had practiced it in mirrors. Everyone adored him at once. Except me. There was something too polished about the way he spoke, too careful in how he touched Rachel's shoulder, as though he was reminding her she belonged to him. I remember giving Ethan his gift that day, a small book of constellation stories and a note that said, "Never stop being brave." He had thrown his little arms around me, and I had felt the warmth of his laugh against my neck. Later, Gregory had presented his own gift, an expensive drone. Everyone had gasped. Ethan had been excited, but when I looked at Gregory, he was watching me, not the boy. His smile didn't reach his eyes. That night when the guests left, Rachel stayed behind to talk. I had known that tone since she was a teenager when she had something rehearsed to say. She stood near the window, arms crossed, her voice calm but cold. "Mom, I know you mean well, but Gregory feels like you're judging him." "I'm not judging anyone," I'd replied, though I could feel my heart tighten. "I just want Ethan safe. Something about him? I can't explain it." Rachel had sighed the way she always did when she wanted to end a conversation. "Please, Mom. Don't start again. He's good for us. He's helping me move on." Move on. The words cut deeper than she knew. We were both still haunted by Alex's death, her late husband, my son-in-law. Losing him had shattered our family. But Gregory was not healing. He was replacing. A week later, I dropped by their house unannounced to bring Ethan a sweater I'd knitted. Gregory opened the door. He stood there for a moment before letting me in. His cologne was sharp, his tone soft. "Mrs. Moore, Rachel's resting. Maybe another day." I glanced past him, hoping to catch a glimpse of my grandson. "I won't stay long," I said. "Just wanted to leave this for Ethan." He smiled faintly, taking the sweater from my hands. "You really should call first." Then he leaned closer, voice barely a whisper. "You worry too much, Mrs. Moore. It's not good for your health." I didn't answer, just stepped back. The way his eyes held mine, it wasn't threatening exactly, but it was a warning. That was the moment I realized he wanted me out of their lives. Weeks passed. Rachel called less often. When she did, she sounded distracted, distant. Once, I asked if I could take Ethan for the weekend. Her reply was cold, almost mechanical. "Greg thinks it's better if we limit visits for a while. Ethan needs consistency." "Consistency," I'd repeated. "I've been in his life since the day he was born." "Mom, please," she said, sighing. "Just give us some space." And that was that. From then on, every birthday, every holiday, every Sunday afternoon, the house stayed quiet. My calls went unanswered. My letters came back unopened. On the second year, Rachel moved to a new address and never told me where. The silence became a second skin. I filled my days with small tasks, tending the roses, reading, pretending not to wait for the phone to ring. Some nights I'd take out the old photo albums, tracing my fingers over Ethan's smiling face. I tried to convince myself he was happy, that Gregory was simply overprotective. But every time I looked into Gregory's eyes in those old pictures, I felt an unease I couldn't name. I remember the day I nearly drove to their new house just to see him from afar. I sat in the car for hours, staring at the map, then turned the key and went home. It felt like giving up. Then one afternoon, a familiar knock came at my door. I opened it to see Nora King, my next-door neighbor, carrying a basket of cherry pie. "You've been quiet again, Evelyn," she said. "Haven't seen you much." I smiled faintly, motioning her inside. Nora was one of the few people who still checked on me. "I guess I've run out of stories to tell," I said, forcing a laugh. She placed the basket on the table and sat opposite me. "That man your daughter married," she said after a pause. "I've seen him around. Always dressed up, always polite. But there's something about the way he looks at people." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" she shrugged. "Just a feeling. He makes me uneasy. Like he's always watching." Those words stayed with me long after she left. Maybe because they echoed my own thoughts. Now, sitting in the same kitchen 3 years later, I watched Ethan stir in his sleep. The bruise on his wrist peeked from under the blanket, faint but visible. My throat tightened. How many nights had I prayed just to hold him again, to make sure he was safe, and now that he was here, the truth terrified me more than the silence ever had. I got up quietly and poured another cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly. The old clock ticked loudly, marking every second of uncertainty. The phone buzzed on the counter, Rachel's name flashing again. I stared at it, the weight of all those unanswered calls pressing down. I couldn't bring myself to pick up. What would I even say? That her son had run away from home in the middle of the night, that the man she trusted was capable of something dark. She wouldn't believe me, she never had. Instead, I looked back at Ethan. He had turned onto his side, murmuring in his sleep. His small fingers tightened around Barnaby's worn paw. I wanted to reach out and smooth his hair, but I hesitated, afraid of waking him. For 3 years I had been silent, because silence was easier than being called paranoid, easier than losing the last thread that tied me to my daughter. But now that Ethan was here trembling and afraid, I realized silence had cost us more than words ever could. When I looked out the window, the sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that never truly wakes. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like it. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and whispered to no one in particular. If I had fought harder back then, maybe none of this would have happened. The house creaked softly, like it was listening. Behind me, Ethan's small voice broke the quiet. "Grandma," I turned. He was sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "It's morning," he said, sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "It's morning." He looked around the room, his expression uncertain, as if making sure it was real. Then he whispered, "Do you think Mom's mad at me?" My heart ached. "No, honey. She's just confused right now." He nodded slowly, hugging Barnaby tighter. "She listens to him too much." I froze. "Who?" He didn't answer, just stared down at his bear. "He tells her what to do. Even when she cries." I felt my knees weaken. I wanted to hold him, to tell him everything would be fine, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I sat beside him and said quietly, "You don't have to talk about it now. You just rest. Grandma's here." He leaned against me, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The clock kept ticking. Outside, a single bird began to sing. 3 years of silence had passed, and in that fragile morning light, I knew it was over. I couldn't go back to pretending anymore. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever Ethan had seen, I was going to find out. I looked down at him, his face soft in the dim light, and whispered to myself, "You're safe now, my love. But this time I won't let them take you away again." The smell of toast and coffee drifted through the kitchen, but Ethan sat at the table without touching a thing. The morning light came in soft through the blinds, glinting off the spoon in front of him. He looked small and pale, lost in thought, his fingers twisting the edge of Barnaby's worn ear. I placed a plate of scrambled eggs before him and smiled, trying to sound normal. "Here, sweetheart, eat a little. It'll make you feel better." He didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the window, as if he expected someone to appear there at any moment. "He'll find me," he whispered. "He always does." The fork slipped from my hand, clinking against the counter. "Who, Ethan?" I asked softly, but he didn't answer. His lips pressed tight, his small shoulders trembling under the oversized sweatshirt I had given him. I sat beside him, laying a hand over his. His skin was cold. "You're safe here," I said gently. "No one knows you're here." He shook his head and spoke so quietly I almost didn't catch it. He said, "Walls have ears." The words sank like stones in my stomach. I wanted to pull him into my arms, to promise that nothing could reach him in this house, but fear threaded through my veins. Gregory's shadow still loomed large, even though he was miles away. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see that dark SUV again parked and waiting. Ethan didn't touch his food. His eyes had that hollow look I'd seen in children after nightmares. I poured hot chocolate into his mug and said softly, "You used to love mornings like this, remember? You and I would make pancakes shaped like stars." He gave the faintest nod. "That was before." "Before what, honey?" He didn't answer right away. His throat moved as if he were swallowing back words. Then, in a trembling voice, he said, "Before he told me not to talk about the basement." The word stopped my breath. I froze, afraid that moving would make him retreat again. "The basement," I repeated carefully. "What about it?" Ethan's eyes darted toward me, then away. His voice was fragile, but each syllable carried dread. He said, "No one's allowed there, not even Mom. He locks it every night." A chill ran through me. I remembered Rachel once mentioning Gregory's workshop, his private space, she'd called it. I'd never thought much about it, but now I could almost hear the sound of a door creaking open in my mind, the echo of steps descending into darkness. Ethan fidgeted with his spoon, his knuckles white. "Sometimes I hear things, Grandma." I leaned closer, keeping my voice low. "What kind of things?" He hesitated, his lower lip trembling. "Crying. Like a little girl. And then it stops." The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence between us. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until my chest ached. He continued, voice breaking. I saw him bring something down there one night. It was big, wrapped in a blanket. He said if I told anyone, Mom would disappear too. I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. My mouth was dry, but I forced my tone calm for his sake. You did the right thing coming here, Ethan. You were so brave. His eyes met mine for the first time that morning, and for a brief second I saw the little boy he once was. The one who used to run to me with scraped knees and 1,000 questions about the stars. But that innocence had been replaced by fear too heavy for his small shoulders. I rose, grabbed the towel hanging by the sink, and knelt in front of him. As I wiped a smudge of chocolate from his cheek, I noticed faint marks on his wrist, round and uneven, like old bruises. Who did this? I asked, trying not to let my voice tremble. He pulled his sleeve down quickly. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, I said, my throat tightening. He shook his head, eyes filling with tears. He said accidents happen when people don't listen. I couldn't breathe. My hand hovered near his, wanting to comfort him, but I knew pressing him too hard might shatter what little trust he had left. When he finished his drink, I led him to the couch and wrapped the quilt around him again. He curled up, clutching Barnaby tight. You're safe now, I whispered, brushing the hair from his forehead. He can't get you here. But as I said the words, I wasn't sure if I believed them. The rain began again, tapping gently on the windows. I sat across from him, hands folded, my mind racing. Basement. Crying. Blanket. My imagination ran wild, painting pictures I didn't want to see. I thought about calling the police, but then what? They'd ask for proof. All I had were a child's words and a heart full of dread. I needed more. That afternoon, when Ethan finally drifted into a nap, I quietly looked through the small backpack he'd brought. Inside were a few clothes, a broken flashlight, a small notebook filled with doodles, and one piece of paper folded several times. I opened it. The drawing made my blood run cold. Crayon lines, rough and shaky, formed the outline of a man holding a flashlight near a red door. Behind it, dark scribbles filled the page, and within them a tiny figure, hands outstretched, mouth open in a silent scream. At the bottom, in Ethan's uneven handwriting, were 3 words, "She's still there." My knees weakened. I sank into the chair, staring at the drawing, the weight of it pressing down like a storm. I heard soft footsteps behind me. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hair messy, Barnaby dragging by one arm. "That's the basement," he said quietly. I folded the paper quickly, not wanting to frighten him more. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to think about that right now." He shook his head. "You don't understand." He said she was sick. But she cried every night. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. His eyes welled up and he climbed into my lap, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him, rocking gently the way I used to when he was little. He was trembling, his breath hitching with quiet sobs. "I didn't tell," he whispered. "I didn't tell Grandma." My tears came, then silent, helpless. I kissed the top of his head. "You did nothing wrong. You're safe now, my love." But in my mind, the words he'd drawn kept echoing. "She's still there." By evening, the house grew dark again. I lit the lamp near the couch, and Ethan fell asleep on my lap, clutching Barnaby. I stared at the rain running down the window pane, each droplet catching the dim light like fragments of truth refusing to stay hidden. When the clock struck 10, the phone rang. I jumped. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. I grabbed the receiver, heart pounding. "Mrs. Moore." The voice was smooth, calm, unmistakable. "Gregory." My throat tightened. "What do you want?" He chuckled softly. "Just to check on you. Rachel said she's worried. You've always been emotional." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "If you come near this house, I'll call the police." His tone stayed almost pleasant. "No need for threats, Mrs. Moore. I only wanted to remind you Ethan has a vivid imagination. Don't let his stories confuse you. You stay away from him," I hissed. He paused, then said quietly, "Walls have ears. Be careful what you say." The line went dead. I stood there, the receiver pressed against my ear long after the dial tone faded. The room felt smaller, the shadows thicker. I looked at Ethan, sleeping peacefully, unaware that his words had already reached the monster he was running from. I locked the doors, checked every window twice, and sat awake through the night listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint hiss of rain, and the heavy silence that followed each sound. My heart was loud in my chest. By morning, I knew two things for certain: my grandson was telling the truth, and the danger wasn't just a memory, it was still out there, breathing, waiting, and I would do whatever it took to keep him safe. The rain had stopped, leaving the city draped in fog. I stood by the window watching the pale light seep through the clouds. The world looked calm, but my mind was not. Ethan was in the next room, still asleep, curled up with Barnaby. Every time the floor creaked, my chest tightened, expecting the sound of a car pulling up or a knock on the door. I tried to breathe. Tried to think. Gregory's voice from the night before still echoed in my ears. Walls have ears. Be careful what you say. On the kitchen counter, yesterday's newspaper lay open. Gregory's picture stared back at me, smiling that well-practiced smile under the headline, "Gregory Hall, Businessman of the Year." The article praised him for his success in real estate, his charity fund for at-risk youth, his perfect family. I stared at his photo, feeling the chill return. The man the city admired was the same man who had left bruises on my grandson's arms. I picked up my old laptop, the one that took forever to start. When the screen finally blinked to life, I typed his name into the search bar. Dozens of results appeared: interviews, award ceremonies, smiling photos beside city officials. Then, buried beneath all the praise, one small headline from 5 years ago caught my eye. Hall Industries, sued for labor violations. I clicked. The article mentioned unsafe work conditions, missing employees, a lawsuit quietly settled out of court. There was a name: Marlene Vega, a construction worker who had disappeared during one of his projects. No follow-up, no closure. The company had called it a misunderstanding. My heart sank. I printed the page and laid it beside the newspaper photo. The contrast was almost obscene: the perfect man and the erased woman. I was still staring at the paper when I heard a soft knock at the door. My pulse spiked. Then a familiar voice: "Evelyn, it's me, Nora." I opened the door and exhaled. My neighbor stood there holding a pie, her silver hair tied back neatly, her eyes sharp with concern. "You look pale," she said, stepping inside. "I brought you something warm. You've been up all night again, haven't you?" I nodded. "I can't stop thinking about it, Nora." The things Ethan said. The basement. The crying. She placed the pie on the table and sat across from me. "I believe him," she said firmly. "That man gives me the creeps. I've seen him driving home late, always looking over his shoulder." "You've seen him at night?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes around 2 or 3 in the morning. Once I saw him dragging something into the garage. I thought it was tools or furniture, but—" She trailed off. "Now, after what you told me, I'm not so sure." My hands trembled. "If he's doing something in there, we need proof. Something real." Nora looked thoughtful. "I still have my security cameras. The one facing the street might catch his house. I'll check the footage. Maybe it recorded something." I reached across the table, gripping her hand. "Thank you, Nora." "Don't thank me yet," she said softly. "Let's see what the shadows have to say first." That evening, after Ethan went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about the last time I'd seen Gregory in person. It had been about a year ago at the grocery store. I remembered the way his smile never faltered when he spoke to me. "Mrs. Moore," he had said, smoothly, "you should move on. Rachel's worried about you. It's not healthy to dwell on the past." I had wanted to tell him I wasn't the one dwelling, that he was, but something in his tone froze me. Then he leaned closer, the scent of his cologne sharp as metal. "Stay away from my family," he murmured, almost tenderly. "You don't want to make trouble." At the time, I thought he was just being protective. Now I realized it had been a warning. I was still lost in that memory when the phone rang. My heart jumped. I picked up, expecting silence, but it was Rachel. "Mom," she said, her voice thin and exhausted. "Greg told me you've been saying strange things again." "Strange things," I repeated, my throat tightening. "He said you think he's dangerous, that you're confusing Ethan." Her words came out fast, practiced. You're scaring him, Mom. Rachel, I interrupted softly, listen to me. Ethan came here because he's afraid. He told me things. About the basement. About crying sounds. About. She cut me off sharply. Mom, stop. You've let your imagination get away from you. Gregory's done everything for us. You should be grateful he even still cares about keeping in touch after the way you've treated him. Tears welled in my eyes. I've only ever cared about you and Ethan. There was a pause then, her voice cracked. You'll ruin my marriage if you keep this up. Rachel, open your eyes. He's not who you think he is. I can't do this right now, she said, and the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the silence louder than any scream. When Nora came by later that night, I told her about the call. She frowned deeply. He's isolating her. Classic. Make everyone think you're the problem until you're the only one who sees the truth. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I checked the footage, she said, handing it to me. The angle isn't great, but look. On the small screen, I saw Gregory's driveway under the dim streetlight. Around 2:14 a.m., his car appeared. He got out, glancing around before popping the trunk. He pulled out a long, narrow object, something wrapped in plastic, and carried it inside. My chest tightened as I watched him disappear through the garage door. The timestamp blinked in the corner 2 nights ago. This can't be coincidence, I whispered. No, Nora said. It can't. I pressed my fingers to my lips, trembling. We have to take this to the police. Nora looked uncertain. Do you think they'll listen? I met her gaze. They'll have to. The next morning I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me jump. At dawn I checked on Ethan. He was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at the window. Grandma, he said quietly, can we move somewhere else? Somewhere he can't find us. I knelt beside him. No one's going to find you here, sweetheart. His voice was flat. He always finds people. I hugged him tightly, my heart breaking at how matter-of-fact he sounded, like a child who'd already seen too much of the world. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait another day. I packed the printouts, the photos, the USB with Nora's video, and slid them into an envelope. My hands shook as I wrote the label, Portland Police Department Evidence. Before leaving, I looked at Ethan one last time. He was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing something in his notebook. I walked over and bent down to kiss the top of his head. I'll be right back. Nora's here if you need anything. He nodded, but his hand didn't stop moving the pencil across the page. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his drawing. It was a house, Gregory's house. And beside it, in red crayon, a dark door at the bottom with 3 small words scrawled beside it, "Don't open it." Outside, the sky was heavy and gray again. I clutched the envelope to my chest, my resolve hardening. For years I'd been silent, afraid of being called paranoid, afraid of losing my daughter. But now it wasn't about pride or fear, it was about that child in the basement and the boy asleep in my home. As I walked down the wet street toward Nora's car, my mind repeated the same promise over and over: no more silence. No more lies. I will bring the truth into the light. The sky was still gray when Nora called early the next morning. Evelyn, you need to come over, she said, her voice tight. I've got something you have to see. I slipped on my coat and hurried across the yard, my shoes crunching the damp gravel. Nora stood at her kitchen table, her laptop open, the same video paused on screen. It's clearer this time, she said. I adjusted the brightness. Look. The recording showed Gregory's driveway under the faint glow of the streetlight. The timestamp flashed again, 1:47 a.m. He parked his car, opened the trunk, and dragged a large, heavy shape toward the garage. Even with the improved quality, I couldn't see what it was, but it was too small to be furniture, too awkward to be a tool. My stomach churned. Nora watched me, her expression grave. You see what I mean now, something's not right. I'm going to the police, I said quietly. Today. Good, she replied, though her eyes showed doubt. But first, maybe talk to that teacher you mentioned, the one Ethan trusts. Sometimes children say things at school they can't say at home. I hesitated. The thought of leaving the house again terrified me, but she was right. If I wanted people to listen, I needed more than just my word and a shaky video. By noon, I was standing in front of Rosewood Elementary. The air smelled faintly of chalk and wet leaves. The sound of children laughing echoed through the halls, a sound that once would have comforted me but now only made my heart ache. I hadn't stepped inside a school since I retired from teaching. For a moment I almost turned back, but then I saw her. Miss Lopez, Ethan's teacher, was standing near the classroom door sorting papers. She looked up when she saw me, her expression curious but kind. "Mrs. Moore," I nodded. "I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I need to talk to you. It's about Ethan." She led me into the teacher's lounge, a small room lined with faded posters and the smell of coffee. "Is he all right?" she asked immediately. I took a deep breath. "He's with me now. He ran away from home." Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness." Why, I hesitated, trying to steady my voice. "Because he's afraid. He told me things, terrible things about his stepfather." Miss Lopez's brow furrowed. "I've noticed changes in him lately," she said slowly. "He used to be so cheerful. But lately he's been quiet. He jumps at noises, flinches when someone raises their voice. I've been worried." I nodded, grateful that someone else saw it too. "He also draws things," I said softly. "Pictures of a basement, a door, someone crying." The teacher's expression darkened. "Wait here." She walked to a file cabinet, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a folder. When she opened it, I saw a stack of papers inside Ethan's school drawings. She spread them across the table. The first one showed a house, its windows dark, a red door at the bottom corner. The next was stranger, a figure holding a flashlight, another figure, much smaller, standing behind bars made of thick, black crayon lines. My hand went to my mouth. "Oh God," I whispered. "There's more, Miss Lopez," said, hesitating before pulling out one last drawing. It was filled with dark scribbles, shadows, and messy shapes, but in the center, in a shaky scrawl of red, were 3 words. "She's still there." I felt dizzy. The same words Ethan had drawn in his notebook. "He's trying to tell us something," I said, my voice barely audible. Miss Lopez nodded. "I thought it was symbolic, some kind of trauma from losing his father, maybe. But if what you're saying is true—" She paused, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Moore, I need to tell you something. Gregory came to the school last week." My heart lurched. "He did?" "Yes. He said he wanted to check on Ethan's progress, but the moment Ethan saw him in the hallway, he froze like he couldn't breathe. I asked Gregory if everything was all right, and he smiled and said, 'Of course. My son just has an active imagination.' Then he leaned close and asked me if Ethan had been drawing anything strange lately." The blood drained from my face. "He knew." She nodded. "His tone, it wasn't normal. It felt like a threat wrapped in politeness." For a moment the room spun. I steadied myself against the table. "You believe me, don't you?" "I do," she said firmly. "And I'll help however I can. I can make copies of these drawings, write a report if needed." Tears burned my eyes. "Thank you. You might be the only one who does." When I left the school, the wind had picked up, scattering yellow leaves across the parking lot. I clutched the drawings to my chest as if they were fragile proof of something only I could see. For the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. But the feeling didn't last. As I walked up my front steps that afternoon, Nora was waiting on the porch, her face pale. "Evelyn," she whispered, "I checked last night's footage again." My pulse quickened, and she held up her phone. He was outside, just standing there across the street, at 2 in the morning. My breath caught. Did he come to the house? No, but he stayed for several minutes. Then his car lights flashed once and he drove off. I looked toward the street, my stomach twisting. "He's watching us." Nora bit her lip. "Evelyn, we can't wait any longer. We need to go to the police again. Maybe with the teacher's testimony they'll have to take it seriously." I nodded, though my hands were shaking. "We'll go tomorrow morning." That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me sit up. I kept the drawings on the nightstand beside me, like a shield, the words, "She's still there," glowing faintly under the lamplight. At some point before dawn, I heard the floorboards creak outside my bedroom. I held my breath, listening. Then came a whisper, soft like the brush of wind. "Grandma," I exhaled and turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, clutching Barnaby. His eyes were wide, glassy with sleep. "What is it, sweetheart?" He stepped closer. "I dreamed about the basement again," he said. "There was a girl. She wanted to go home." I reached for him, pulling him into my arms. "It's just a dream," I murmured, but my voice was unsteady. He shook his head against my shoulder. "It's not a dream, Grandma. I saw her before I left." I froze, unable to speak. He continued, voice trembling. "She looked at me through the little window in the door. She said her name was Harper." The name hit me like lightning. I remembered the missing child posters I'd seen around town, a little girl named Harper Lane gone for a week now. My mind reeled, connecting pieces I wasn't ready to face. Ethan pulled back, eyes pleading. "You believe me, don't you?" I cupped his face, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Of course I do, sweetheart. I believe you." When he finally fell back asleep, I sat in the dark for a long time, the rain tapping faintly against the windows again. The drawings lay spread on the nightstand beside me, the red crayon words seeming almost to glow under the lamplight. In the stillness, I made myself a promise. No matter what it cost, no matter who refused to believe, I would bring the truth into the light. Because if there really was a girl named Harper trapped in that basement, there wasn't a moment left to waste. And as if to echo my resolve, thunder rolled distantly outside, low and steady like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. The next morning the world seemed too quiet. The fog hung low over the street, turning everything gray and shapeless. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and clutched the envelope in my hand, the one holding Ethan's drawings, the printed articles, and Nora's security footage. My breath came out in small clouds as I waited for the bus to downtown. I hadn't been to the police station in years, and I wasn't sure what terrified me more, what they might find, or that they might not believe me at all. When I reached the precinct, the glass doors reflected my anxious face, older, thinner, tired, but determined. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and damp paper. Officers moved about, their voices, a low hum that made me feel like a stranger in a world that ran on procedures and evidence, not fear and instinct. A young officer at the desk looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, holding out the envelope. "My name is Evelyn Moore. I need to speak to someone in charge. It's about a missing girl and my grandson." He frowned slightly, taking the envelope but not opening it. "Do you have an appointment?" "This can't wait," I said firmly. My voice surprised even me, it carried the sharp edge of desperation. After a pause, he sighed and gestured toward a small hallway. "Commander Davis will see you. Second door on the right." The office was small, cluttered, and smelled faintly of tobacco. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s with graying hair and a weary face that had probably seen too many stories like mine. He looked up, his eyes, kind but cautious. "Mrs. Moore, is it?" "Yes. Thank you for seeing me." I placed the envelope in front of him and sat down. "I know how this sounds, but please, just listen before you decide I'm another old woman chasing ghosts." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." So I told him everything. How Ethan had arrived in the middle of the night, terrified and shaking. How he whispered about a girl locked in the basement. The drawings, the bruises, the name Harper. I handed him the photo of the missing girl from the news. He said he saw her, Commander, in that basement. And my neighbor caught this on camera. He took out the USB drive and plugged it into his computer. The footage played the grainy video of Gregory dragging the wrapped object into the garage. Commander Davis leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Do you see it?" I asked. "That's not furniture. That's—" He held up a hand to stop me. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Moore, but this isn't definitive. We can't prove what's inside that wrapping. It could be anything." My stomach dropped. "You think I don't know that? But what if it isn't? What if it's her?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "We've had a lot of reports lately, rumors, people connecting every missing person to every dark basement in the city. Without solid proof, I can't get a warrant to search private property." My pulse pounded in my ears. "My grandson is proof. Look at his drawings, look at his face. He's terrified of that man. Davis glanced at the sketches but said nothing. His tone softened. Mrs. Moore, I believe you're worried. And maybe you're right to be. But unless the child repeats his statement to Child Protective Services, or we get corroborating evidence, there's nothing legal we can do yet. I felt my hands tremble. So you'll wait until there's another headline about a missing child. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting away. We'll file your report, ma'am. Someone will follow up. That phrase, someone will follow up, was a dagger. I knew it was code for, nothing will happen. I stood gripping the edge of the desk. Please. I'm begging you, don't let this be ignored. He exhaled heavily, scribbling something on a notepad. I'll forward it to the missing persons unit. That's all I can promise right now. The walk home felt longer than ever. Every step was heavy, my heart sinking deeper with each block. When I reached my house, the porch light flickered even though it was barely afternoon. Nora was waiting there, her face full of questions. Well, they didn't believe me, I said, my voice breaking. Not really. They'll follow up. That's all. Nora cursed under her breath. Unbelievable. They never move until it's too late. I don't know what else to do, I whispered. Ethan's just a child. If they question him again, Gregory will find out. And then I couldn't finish the sentence. Nora grabbed my shoulders gently. You did the right thing. Maybe the officer will come around once they review the footage. I wanted to believe her. But deep down, I knew better. That night, the house felt different. The air was heavy, the silence sharp. Ethan sat on the floor with Barnaby tracing circles on the rug. I tried to smile, pretending everything was normal. How was your day, sweetheart? He looked up, his eyes wide. You talked to the police, didn't you? I froze. How did you know that? He shrugged, fidgeting with the bear's ear. He called Mom. I heard her yelling on the phone before I left. He said you were trying to ruin everything. My heart skipped a beat. When was this? Yesterday, before I ran away. I knelt beside him. What did he say, Ethan? He hesitated, then whispered. He said if Grandma talks, people will disappear again. The room went cold. Disappear again? He nodded slowly. Like the others. I felt my breath hitch. I didn't ask who the others were. I didn't want to know. After he went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the window. My reflection looked like a stranger. There was a sound outside, a low hum, the roll of a car engine idling somewhere near. I peeked through the curtain. A dark SUV was parked across the street, its headlights off. My heart raced. I reached for the phone, but before I could dial, the car started and rolled away, disappearing into the fog. The next morning, the neighborhood whispers began. At the market, I caught people glancing at me, murmuring behind their hands. One of the vendors stopped me as I passed. Mrs. Moore, she said, carefully, you shouldn't be spreading stories about your son-in-law. People talk. I clenched my jaw. They should be talking about the girl who's missing, not me. She gave me a pitying smile. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe take some time off from all this. As I walked home, I heard snippets, soft voices, mocking tones. Poor old woman. Losing her mind. Her daughter married well. She should be happy. Some people just can't let go. By the time I reached my porch, I was shaking not from fear, but fury. Gregory had gotten to them first. He was poisoning the air just as he had poisoned Rachel against me. When I stepped inside, the smell of apple pie greeted me. Nora was in the kitchen, her face pale. Evelyn, she said quietly, he knows. I stopped. What? I got an email this morning. From an address I don't recognize. It just said, you should have minded your business. She looked up at me, her voice trembling. It was sent 5 minutes after you left the station yesterday. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. He's watching us. She nodded. And he's not going to stop. I glanced toward the hallway where Ethan was playing, his quiet laughter carrying faintly. Then we won't stop either, I said, straightening my shoulders. If the police won't act, we'll find another way. Outside, the fog began to thicken again, swallowing the street in white. I closed the blinds, turned the locks, and pressed my back against the door. For the first time in years, I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. Somewhere out there, a little girl named Harper was still waiting. And I was done waiting with her. The next day, the fog didn't lift. It hung over the street like a shroud, thick and heavy swallowing sound. I stood by the window with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands, watching the silhouettes of cars blur through the mist. Every instinct in me said that something terrible was coming. The police hadn't called back, the neighborhood had gone quiet, and Gregory's name was still echoing in the corners of my mind like a curse that refused to fade. Ethan was sitting on the living room rug drawing again. He pressed hard with his crayons, his small hand moving in quick, tense strokes. I tried to smile. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" He didn't look up. "The dream," he murmured. I knelt beside him, and my stomach tightened when I saw the paper. He'd drawn the same red door again, the basement door. But this time there was something new, two small figures standing in front of it. One had brown hair like his, the other gray streaks like mine. Above them, in shaky blue letters, he'd written, "We open it together." "Ethan," I said softly, "what does this mean?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes distant. "She's still calling Grandma. She says she wants to go home." Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps that made both of us flinch. I stood heart-pounding and went to the peephole. A familiar face peered back. Rachel. When I opened the door, she was standing there in a neat beige coat, her hair perfectly brushed but her eyes were red. "Mom," she said quietly. I froze. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Gregory told me everything. That you went to the police, that you're trying to destroy our family." I shut the door behind her, keeping my voice calm. "I went because I'm scared, Rachel." Ethan came to me terrified, saying things no child should ever say. She spun toward me, her face tightening. "He's confused. You're feeding him lies. Do you have any idea how much you've upset him? How much trouble you've caused?" Ethan stood in the doorway, clutching Barnaby, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom!" Rachel's voice broke. "Ethan, come here. We're going home." He didn't move. He looked from her to me, then back again, his lower lip trembling. "I don't want to." Her face crumpled. "Sweetheart, please. Daddy's worried sick." "Don't call him that," Ethan said sharply. "He's not my dad." The words cut through the air like glass breaking. Rachel froze, her mouth half open, color draining from her cheeks. For a second I saw something flicker in her eyes, doubt, pain, but then it hardened again. "He's your father now," she said quietly, "and you will respect him." Respect him? I couldn't hold back any longer. "Rachel, do you hear yourself? That man terrifies your son," her eyes flashed. "Enough. You've been trying to poison him against Gregory since the beginning." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "He's hiding something, Rachel. There's a girl. A missing child. Ethan knows about her." She blinked, confusion passing over her face, before she shook her head violently. "This is madness." "It's not madness," I said, pulling the folder from the table and opening it, to show her Ethan's drawings and the newspaper clipping. "This is proof. He knows her name, Harper. The same girl who vanished 2 weeks ago." Rachel stared at the page, her lips parting slightly. "Harper," she repeated. Ethan stepped forward. "She's in the basement, Mom." Rachel took a step back as though the words had struck her. "No," she whispered. "That's not." Before she could finish, there was a low rumble from outside, the sound of a car engine stopping. I went to the window, my heart dropping when I saw the dark SUV parked across the street. The door opened and Gregory stepped out, calm and deliberate, his suit crisp as always. He looked up at the house. Rachel's face went pale. "Oh God," she whispered. "He followed me." "Get away from the window," I hissed, pulling the curtains shut. "Ethan, go to your room." "But Grandma," now he ran, clutching Barnaby tight. Rachel turned to me, trembling. "He can't find out I came here. You don't understand what he's capable of." I stared at her. "Then you do know." She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "I've seen things, Mom. Heard things." I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid, like you said you used to be. But lately she broke off, wiping her eyes. "Sometimes I hear crying at night and he says it's the television. But when I go to check, the TV isn't on." I gripped her hands. Rachel, listen to me. You need to tell the police. We'll go together. She shook her head quickly. He'd kill me. You don't understand, he's not just dangerous, he's careful. He knows everyone. The police, the neighbors, he controls them all. Before I could respond, there was another knock. Louder this time, deliberate. Rachel Gregory's voice called calm and composed. Are you in there? Rachel's breath hitched. She looked around, panicked. He'll know. If he finds me here, he'll know. Go to the back door, I whispered. Nora's house connects through the alley. Go now. She hesitated, tears running down her cheeks. What about you? I'll handle him. She stared at me for a moment, then nodded, and slipped quietly toward the kitchen, disappearing out the back. I took a deep breath, wiped my face, and opened the front door. Gregory stood there smiling. Mrs. Moore, he said smoothly. I was hoping we could have a civilized conversation. I doubt that's possible, I said evenly. He chuckled. Always dramatic. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've been busy, haven't you? Police reports, gossiping with neighbors. You really should be careful, people might start thinking you're unstable. Get off my porch, I said quietly. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes gleaming. Where's Rachel? I know she came here. Not here. His smile widened. You know lying doesn't suit you. I said nothing. He took another step closer, his tone dropping. You think you can protect that boy? You have no idea what kind of world you've walked into. My heart pounded, but I met his gaze. If you touch him again, I'll destroy you. His smile faltered for the briefest second, then returned. Be careful what you wish for, Mrs. Moore. He turned and walked back to his car, his shoes crunching on the gravel. I waited until the door shut before locking it and pulling the curtains closed. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't afford fear anymore. Minutes later, Rachel slipped back inside through the kitchen door, her eyes red and wide. Is he gone, for now? She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. He knows everything, Mom. He always knows. I placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we'll make sure this time he doesn't. That night, none of us slept. Rachel stayed in the guest room with Ethan, the two of them huddled together under the quilt. I sat by the window, keeping watch as the fog thickened again, covering the street like a ghostly blanket. When the clock struck midnight, I saw movement outside, a shape by the mailbox, small and quick. I leaned forward. A figure was running down the road barefoot, wearing what looked like a child's nightgown. My breath caught. It was a little girl. I threw open the door and stepped into the cold air, my voice trembling. Wait, stop. The figure turned toward me for only a second, her hair tangled, her face pale and wet with tears, then disappeared into the mist. Behind me, Rachel's voice cracked from the doorway. Mom, what is it? I turned slowly, my heart racing. She's real, I whispered. The girl. Harper. She's out there. And for the first time, Rachel didn't argue. She just stared into the fog, her lips parted, her face drained of color, and whispered back, then, God help us all. The police station smelled of rain-soaked coats and stale coffee. I stood at the front desk, clutching the envelope against my chest, my fingers trembling from the cold and the weight of what I carried. Rachel sat behind me, pale and silent, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Ethan leaned against her leg, holding Barnaby, his eyes darting nervously between the officers. I cleared my throat. Please, I said to the young officer at the counter. We need to see Commander Davis. It's urgent. He glanced up, recognizing me. His polite smile faltered for a second. Mrs. Moore, you again? Yes, I said firmly. And this time I brought witnesses. You need to listen. Before he could respond, Commander Davis appeared from the hallway, a file in hand, his face lined with fatigue. Mrs. Moore, he said, motioning toward his office. Come in. Rachel hesitated, whispering, Mom, are you sure? Yes, I replied. We're not leaving until someone does something. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights. Davis gestured for us to sit. All right, he said wearily. Tell me everything again. I opened the envelope and laid out the photos, drawings, and Nora's footage. Rachel sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on the floor. Ethan clung to Barnaby, whispering to himself. I took a deep breath and began. My grandson came to my house after midnight. He said his stepfather, Gregory Hall, hurt someone. He described a girl locked in their basement. Then he drew this. I slid the crayon drawing across the desk. The red door. The words, "She's still there." Davis studied it for a long moment. "Children have vivid imaginations," he said finally. Rachel's voice broke in trembling. "No. He's telling the truth." He turned to her, surprised. "And you are Rachel Hall," she said quietly. "Gregory's wife." That made him pause. "I see," he said slowly. "And you believe this claim?" Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know what I believe anymore. But last night I saw something. A little girl. She ran past our house and disappeared into the fog." Davis leaned back, rubbing his chin. "You saw her?" "Yes," Rachel said. "She was barefoot, wearing a nightgown. She looked terrified." He tapped a pen on his desk, thinking, "That matches the description of Harper Lane, missing 9 days now." I leaned forward. "Commander, please. You have to go there. You have to search the basement." He sighed. "Mrs. Moore, we've talked about this. Without probable cause, I can't request a warrant. I can't search a private property because of a drawing or a frightened child's word." I slammed my hand on the desk. "What will it take?" "A body." Ethan flinched at my tone and I immediately softened. "I'm sorry," I whispered, squeezing his shoulder. Rachel looked at Davis, her voice shaking but firm. "What if I give permission? It's my house too." He raised his brows. "Technically, yes. But if your husband reports it as unlawful entry, the evidence could be thrown out." The silence that followed was unbearable. I felt the hopelessness closing in again, like a fog too thick to see through. Then, a small voice broke it. "She's hurt," Ethan whispered, "her hands bleeding." We all turned to him. He was staring at the floor, tears in his eyes. "She told me last night." I heard her crying again. My throat tightened. "He dreams about her," I said quietly. "Every night." Davis rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'll tell you what he said finally. I'll send an officer to drive by the house tonight. If we see or hear anything suspicious, we'll proceed." "That's not enough," I said. "It's all I can do, ma'am." We left the precinct in silence. Outside, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. Rachel walked beside me, her face drained. "He's never going to help us," she murmured. I shook my head. "Then we'll help ourselves." When we reached home, Nora was waiting on the porch with her coat pulled tight. "I saw his car again," she whispered. "Parked 2 streets down." Rachel's eyes widened. "He's watching, yes, I think so. But that's not the worst part." She pulled her phone from her pocket and showed me a message. "You talk too much." No name, no number, just those 4 words. My hands went cold. "He's taunting us." Rachel leaned against the railing, shaking. "Oh God. What are we going to do?" "We gather proof," I said. "Real proof. Something they can't ignore." That night the storm returned. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, I checked on Ethan and Rachel. They were both asleep in the guest room, his small body curled against hers. I stood in the hallway, listening to the rain, trying to steady my breath. When the clock struck 2, I heard a soft thud from outside, then another. I moved to the window. The street was empty, but the motion sensor light flicked on by Nora's garage. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. No answer. Then another sound, closer this time. A metallic click like a door latch. I slipped into my shoes and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The rain hit my face like needles as I stepped onto the porch. The light from Nora's yard was still on, swinging faintly in the wind. I called out softly, "Nora," no answer. My feet sank into the wet grass as I crossed the yard. Her back door was ajar, swaying slightly with the wind. "Nora," I whispered again. Inside the kitchen, light was on. A mug lay shattered on the floor, coffee spilling across the tiles. My stomach dropped. "Nora." Then from the living room came a small noise, a whimper. I followed it, my heart pounding so hard it drowned the rain. The flashlight beam landed on the couch and for a moment I saw movement. It was Nora. She was sitting upright, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. Nora, I rushed to her side. What happened? She blinked slowly, her lips trembling. He was here, she whispered. He came inside. Gregory, she nodded weakly. He didn't hurt me. He just stood there. He said, "You should have stayed out of this." Then he left. I felt the blood drain from my face. "We need to call the police." She grabbed my wrist. "No, don't." He said if I did, he'd make sure we both regret it. Her words hung in the air like smoke. I helped her to her feet and locked the doors before leading her to sit down. The storm outside had reached its peak, lightning flashing through the windows. When I finally returned home, Rachel was waiting by the door, her eyes wide with fear. "Where were you?" "Next door," I said. "He's escalating." She covered her face with her hands. "He knows everything we do." I nodded slowly. "And that means he's scared." "Scared," she repeated, disbelief in her voice. "Yes," I said quietly. "Because he knows we're getting close." The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. I stood there in the dark living room, staring at the rain-streaked glass, and made myself a promise I'd never dared to make before. If the police refused to open that door, then I would, even if it meant walking straight into the darkness myself. The morning news played softly on the old television, the anchor's voice calm and practiced until the words cut through the quiet like a blade. Authorities continue to search for 9-year-old Harper Lane, missing now for 10 days. Neighbors describe her as a bright, cheerful girl who was last seen near Rosewood Avenue. My breath caught. Rosewood Avenue. That was only 2 streets from Gregory's house. I turned up the volume. The screen showed a school photo of Harper, brown hair, blue eyes, a shy smile. Ethan looked up from his cereal, his spoon suspended midair. "That's her," he whispered. "That's the girl from the basement." Rachel's hand froze halfway to her coffee mug. She looked at me, eyes wide. "Mom." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The image of the girl on the screen, and the one from Ethan's drawings, overlapped in my mind, the same shape, the same soft curls. Harper wasn't just a name in the dark anymore, she was real, and she was somewhere close. The anchor continued. Police have received multiple reports but no confirmed leads. Anyone with information is urged to call. I turned the TV off. The silence afterward was deafening. Rachel's voice trembled. "He said she was a runaway." I didn't believe him, but, "Oh my God, Mom," Ethan whispered. "He hurt her." I felt my throat tighten. "Not anymore," I said. "Not if we can stop him." For the first time, Rachel didn't argue. She just nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Nora came over an hour later with her raincoat still dripping. "You saw the news?" she asked, setting her phone on the table. "Everyone's talking about it. They found a piece of Harper's nightgown in the woods near Brookline Drive. That's not far from the Hall property." Rachel's face went white. No. "She's alive," Ethan said, suddenly his voice small but certain. "I know she is." I put my arm around him. "We'll find her, sweetheart." "We will." That afternoon, Nora and I spread everything across the dining table: photos, printouts, hand-drawn maps, the drawings from Ethan, and the list of Gregory's past construction projects. The pattern was starting to form like a puzzle, aligning piece by piece. 3 missing people in the last 5 years, all near properties Gregory had managed or purchased. All quietly dismissed as unrelated. Rachel watched, pale and silent, her fingers trembling as she traced the map. "He was working on a house near Brookline 2 years ago," she murmured. "He said it was an investment property." "An investment in what?" I said bitterly. We worked late into the evening, connecting lines, circling locations. Every new discovery made the air heavier. When we finally looked up, it was dark outside. The streetlights cast long shadows across the window, and I thought I saw a shape moving across the lawn. My pulse quickened. Nora closed the blinds. She did, her movements quick. "Do you think he knows what we're doing?" "I think he's always known," I said. Rachel's phone buzzed, then startling all of us. She picked it up and I saw the color drain from her face. "It's him." Ethan's eyes widened. "Don't answer." Rachel hesitated, then pressed the speaker button. Gregory's voice slid through the line, smooth, calm, deliberate. "Rachel," he said softly, "you shouldn't be there." No one spoke. "You think hiding behind your mother will protect you," he continued. "You think the police won't see through her delusions. They already have." I stepped closer to the phone. "You're finished, Gregory. We know about Harper. We know what's in your basement." There was a pause, then, a low amused chuckle. "Do you? Then come see for yourself." The line went dead. Rachel dropped the phone, her hands shaking. "He knows we called the police. He knows everything." Ethan clutched Barnaby to his chest. "He's not supposed to know," he whispered. Nora stood, her voice trembling. "That's it. I'm done waiting. We go to the police again now, with everything." Within the hour, we were back at the precinct. This time, we demanded to see Commander Davis. He looked tired when we entered, but the sight of Rachel and the stack of new evidence made him sit up straighter. "You again," he said, but his tone was less dismissive. "What do you have this time?" Rachel pushed the folder across the desk. "Property records, witness accounts. The missing girl, Harper Lane. My son saw her. You said you needed more. This is more." He opened the folder, flipping through the documents slowly. When he came to the photo of Gregory's driveway and the footage, timestamps, his brow furrowed. "Where did you get this?" "My neighbor's security camera," I said. "She's been recording every night. Gregory's been coming and going at strange hours. Look at the date, just before Harper went missing." He leaned back, exhaling heavily. "You understand. If this checks out, we'll need to coordinate with Child Services, the DA, and possibly another jurisdiction." "Commander," I interrupted. "While you coordinate, a little girl is trapped somewhere." He met my eyes, and for the first time I saw something shift there. Doubt maybe, but also recognition. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'll look into it." Outside, we sat in the car, rain pattering against the windshield. No one spoke. Ethan leaned against me, half asleep, exhausted from everything he'd seen. Rachel stared at her hands, whispering prayers under her breath. When Davis finally returned, his expression was no longer tired, it was grave. "We found something," he said. "A connection. The girl Harper attended the same after-school program Gregory's company sponsored. She disappeared after a visit to one of his sites." Rachel gasped. "Then it's him. It has to be him." He nodded slowly. "It's enough for a search warrant. We'll execute it at dawn." For a long moment no one moved. Then I whispered, "Thank you." He nodded again. "Mrs. Moore, I'll need you to stay put tonight. If what you're saying is true, I don't want to risk him knowing we're coming." But when we got home, the feeling of relief didn't come. The house felt different, too quiet, too still. I checked every lock twice, then sat by the window watching the rain blur the streetlights. Somewhere in that storm, I knew he was still out there watching us back. Around midnight, a car slowed in front of the house. My breath hitched. The headlights dimmed, and through the fogged glass I could make out the shape of a man inside. I ducked behind the curtain, heart hammering, and whispered, "He's here." Rachel rushed to the window, pulling it back just enough to see. "It's him." The car idled for a moment longer, then drove off, slowly disappearing into the mist. Nora, who had stayed the night, whispered, "He's testing us. Seeing if we're scared." "He'll find out soon enough," I said. "Because by tomorrow morning he won't be the one watching anymore." I turned off the lights and sat there in the dark, listening to the rain until my eyes stung. Dawn was only a few hours away, and with it, the truth we'd been chasing for so long. But as I watched the street outside fade into fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over yet, it was only waiting for the door to break open. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn. It came down in gray sheets that blurred the world beyond the windshield. I sat in the back of the police car beside Nora, my hands clutched tightly around my purse, the fabric damp from sweat. Up ahead, a row of black SUVs lined the curb outside Gregory's house. Red and blue lights pulsed faintly against the fog, flashing across the brick walls and the wet pavement. Commander Davis stood by his vehicle, talking into a radio. When he saw us, he nodded once. "Stay in the car," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, do not come inside." Rachel sat beside me, her face pale, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "He'll know it was me," she whispered. "He'll know I told." I squeezed her hand. "Let him know. The truth is finally coming for him." Ethan was safe with a social worker back at the station. I had kissed his forehead before leaving and promised I'd be back soon. He didn't answer, only held Barnaby tighter. The image of his wide, frightened eyes stayed with me now, as the officers approached the front steps of Gregory's house. The rain softened for a moment, the air still, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Then Commander Davis raised his voice. "Portland Police Department, we have a warrant." No answer. He motioned for 2 officers to move forward. They pounded on the door again, louder this time. "Open up, Mr. Hall." From where I sat, I could see the house's dark windows like blank eyes staring back. Then, faintly, a light flickered behind one of them. Davis's jaw tightened. "Breach it." The first strike of the battering ram echoed through the rain, a hollow thud that made Rachel flinch. The second hit splintered the door. On the third, it swung open with a sharp crack, slamming into the wall. Officers rushed inside. The sound of boots against tile, muffled voices, the crackle of radios. Then silence. I leaned forward, heart hammering. "Why is it so quiet?" Nora reached out, grabbing my arm. "Stay still, Evelyn." A minute passed. 2. The waiting was unbearable. Then came a shout from inside. "Basement door, we found it. I didn't think I just moved." Before Nora could stop me, I was out of the car, the cold rain hitting my face as I stumbled toward the house. Rachel followed, crying out, "Mom, wait!" The officers didn't see me slip through the doorway. The air inside smelled of damp wood and bleach. The lights flickered overhead. I followed the sound of voices down the hallway until I reached the narrow stairwell that led to the basement. Commander Davis was at the bottom, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Mrs. Moore, you can't be here," he said sharply. But I was already descending the steps. "She's down here, isn't she?" He didn't answer. The silence below was heavier than the rain outside. Then someone shouted, "Sir, over here." The beam of light swung toward the far corner of the basement. The smell hit me first, mold rust, something metallic beneath it all. A small figure huddled there, wrapped in a dirty blanket. "Oh my God," I whispered. The little girl looked up. Her face was pale, streaked with grime, her eyes red from crying. She flinched at the sight of strangers. "It's all right," one of the officers said, gently kneeling beside her. "You're safe now, Harper," I breathed. She blinked at me, uncertain, then clutched the blanket tighter. "Please," she said, her voice raw, "don't let him come back." Rachel was behind me now, crying quietly. "Dear Lord," she whispered. Davis radioed for paramedics. "We've got her. She's alive." As they lifted Harper into their arms, I stepped closer. Her small hand brushed mine, trembling. "He said Grandma would find me," she murmured. My throat closed. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're safe." The officers moved quickly, guiding her up the stairs. I followed, my knees weak, my heart breaking with relief and horror. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Neighbors had gathered at the edge of the street, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. The ambulance lights painted everything red and blue. Then, a voice behind us made everyone turn. "What's happening here?" Gregory stood at the gate, soaked to the bone, his suit jacket hanging limp in the rain. His eyes darted from the officers to the stretcher to Rachel and finally to me, his face twisted. "What the hell is this?" Commander Davis stepped forward. "Gregory Hall, you're under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and obstruction of justice." Gregory laughed, a sharp, unhinged sound that made the hairs on my arms rise. "You're making a mistake," he said, raising his hands as the officers approached. "That woman," he pointed at me, "she's insane. She's been stalking me for years." "Save it for your lawyer," Davis said flatly. As they cuffed him, he turned his head toward me, his eyes burning. "You think this is over," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've started." I met his gaze without flinching. "It's over," I said. "For you, it's over." They pushed him toward the waiting car. Rachel stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth. "Mom," she whispered, "what have we done? What we should have done 3 years ago," I said. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and Harper's small face disappeared behind the tinted glass. The sound of the siren faded as it drove away, leaving behind only the patter of rain and the murmurs of neighbors. Commander Davis turned to me. "Mrs. Moore, we'll need your statement again, but for now, go home. Rest." I nodded numbly. My legs barely carried me back to Nora's car. Rachel followed silently, her eyes fixed on the flashing lights fading in the distance. When we pulled into my driveway, the street was still wet, the air smelling of rain and relief. I stepped out my shoes, sinking slightly into the mud. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift from my chest, but underneath it was something heavier still. Inside, the house was quiet. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. Ethan's drawings were still spread across the table, the red door staring back at me like a wound finally closed. I traced my fingers over the words "she's still there" and whispered, "Not anymore." Rachel sank onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't believe you," she said between sobs. "I didn't believe my own son." I knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You see now why I couldn't stay quiet." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How do I tell Ethan? Tell him the truth," I said softly. "That he saved her." Outside, the sirens had faded completely. All that remained was the steady drip of rain from the eaves and the faint hum of distant thunder. I sat down exhausted, but my heart finally felt steady. The storm had passed, but its echo would remain for a long time. And as I looked toward the window, I knew that tomorrow would bring questions, news crews, gossip, and judgment, but none of that mattered. Because somewhere in a hospital bed, a little girl was safe. And upstairs, my grandson was sleeping without fear for the first time in years. For the first time in forever, the world felt quiet again. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was pale blue, washed clean, and the street outside shimmered with puddles that caught the sunlight like pieces of glass. I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The house was finally quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, a silence too fragile to trust. Rachel was sitting at the table, her eyes red, a newspaper spread out in front of her. The headline read, "Local businessman arrested in child abduction case." Beneath it, Gregory's photograph stared back at us, his suit immaculate, his eyes cold even in print. I set my cup down. "It's strange," I murmured, seeing him there. "The whole city used to think he was perfect." Rachel didn't look up. "So did I," she said softly. "I thought he was saving us." "You wanted to believe he could," I said. "We all did. But the kind of man who hides behind charm always has something to hide." She folded the paper and pressed her palms against it, as if she could crush his face out of existence. "I should have seen it," she whispered. "Ethan tried to tell me. You tried to tell me." I didn't listen. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You were surviving, Rachel. You can't blame yourself for wanting peace." Her eyes filled with tears. "Peace," she repeated bitterly. "It doesn't feel like peace now. It feels like something's broken and can't be put back together." I didn't argue. Some things couldn't be repaired, only carried. Later that morning, a police cruiser pulled up in front of the house. Commander Davis stepped out, his coat buttoned tight against the chill. He looked tired, but his expression had softened. "Mrs. Moore," he greeted, nodding politely to Rachel. "I wanted to update you before the press gets ahead of us." Rachel tensed. "Is he talking?" Davis hesitated before answering. "Not much. But the evidence is strong. Harper's statement matches your son's drawings almost exactly. The medical team confirmed she'd been locked in that basement for at least a week." I felt my chest tighten. "And Harper, how is she?" "She's stable. Weak but talking. Her parents are with her now." A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped me. "Thank God." Davis continued, flipping open his notebook. "Gregory Hall is being charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of child endangerment. We also found some disturbing documents in the basement: notes, symbols, contact names. We believe he might have been connected to a larger network." Rachel's face went white. "A network? You mean there are others?" Davis closed the notebook. "We're investigating. But for now, Mrs. Hall, I need you and your mother to stay alert. We don't know how far this goes." Rachel nodded faintly, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "I can't believe I let him into our lives." "You're not the only one he fooled," Davis said gently. "Predators like him depend on people's trust. But he's behind bars now. And thanks to you, he looked at me and your grandson. We got to that little girl before it was too late." When he left, Rachel and I stood in silence for a long while. Through the window, the street gleamed under the late morning light, deceptively peaceful. The neighbors who had once whispered behind my back were now pretending not to stare as the police car drove away. I saw Mrs. Hayes from the bakery across the street pause by her mailbox clutching a brown paper bag. She caught my eye and quickly crossed over. "Mrs. Moore," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. We were wrong about you." I opened the door a little wider. "You didn't know?" "No, but we should have listened," she said. "We all thought you were losing your mind. But you were the only one who saw the truth." I smiled faintly. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It just waits for someone brave enough to listen. She blinked back tears. "You saved that girl's life. You should be proud." "I'm proud of Ethan," I said. "He's the one who never stopped hearing her." After she left, I sat on the porch steps, the wooden boards still damp beneath me. The air smelled of wet earth and clean beginnings. I thought of all the nights I had sat there before praying, waiting, wondering if anyone would believe me. And now, the same neighbors who had turned away were leaving flowers on my walkway, murmuring their apologies. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like release, a deep, aching exhale after years of holding my breath. Rachel came out and sat beside me. "Do you think Ethan will ever be okay?" she asked quietly. "He's stronger than you think," I said. "He's already teaching us what courage looks like." She gave a shaky laugh. "He gets that from you." I smiled. "Maybe from both of us." That afternoon the phone rang. It was the hospital. A soft-spoken woman introduced herself as Mrs. Vance Harper's mother. "Mrs. Moore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't have the words. If you and your family hadn't acted, I might never have seen my daughter again." I swallowed hard. "You don't owe me thanks. Just hold her close. That's all that matters." "I'd like to meet you," she said. "Harper keeps asking for the lady who found her." I felt tears sting my eyes. "Maybe soon," I said softly. "When she's ready." After we hung up, I sat by the window again, watching the sunlight stretch long across the floorboards. The house felt warmer, somehow alive again. Upstairs, I could hear Ethan's laughter, faint but real, floating through the open door. He and Rachel were sitting together on the floor of his room, building something with blocks. When I stepped in, he looked up and smiled. "Grandma, look, I made a house that can't fall down." I knelt beside him, running my hand over his hair. "That's a good kind of house," I said. "One built strong." Rachel met my eyes, her smile trembling. "He's sleeping better. No more nightmares." I knotted my throat too tight to speak. That evening the sun dipped low, turning the sky gold. Nora came over with a casserole, her eyes still shadowed with fatigue. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "One day at a time," I said. "But it's quieter now." "That's enough for me." She set the dish on the counter and turned to me, her voice soft. "Evelyn, you did something extraordinary. You made people see what they didn't want to see. Don't ever forget that." "I don't think I could, even if I tried," I said. When night came, I sat alone in the living room, the lamplight pooling softly around the photographs on the wall. There was one of Alex, Rachel's late husband, his smile easy, his eyes kind. I touched the frame, whispering, "It's done, Alex. I kept my promise." The clock ticked gently. Outside, crickets began to sing again, their rhythm steady and alive. I thought about Harper in the hospital, about her mother's trembling voice, about Ethan sleeping safely upstairs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check the locks twice. Tomorrow the headlines would fade. People would move on. But I knew some stories never really ended. They simply changed shape, becoming lessons etched into the quiet places of our hearts. As I turned off the light, the reflection in the window showed a woman older than she remembered being but unbroken. The storm had taken everything from me once, but now, in its wake, it had given something back. Peace. Fragile, fleeting, but real. The morning sun spilled softly through the window, painting golden lines across the old wooden floor. The house felt different now, lighter, warmer, as if every shadow that once clung to the walls had finally released its hold. The air smelled of toast and coffee, and somewhere in the living room, laughter echoed. I stood in the kitchen holding my cup and watching the light move slowly across the table. It had been weeks since that night, but I still caught myself pausing to listen to the silence, to the stillness, to make sure it was truly peace I was hearing. Ethan's voice rang from the porch. "Grandma, look." He was running barefoot across the yard, his small legs chasing after a paper airplane that floated lazily in the morning breeze. Beside him, Harper giggled, her hair gleaming in the sun. She was thinner now, still shy, but her laughter was clear and bright, a sound I hadn't known I needed until I heard it. Rachel sat on the steps with a cup of tea watching them play. Her face had color again, her eyes no longer clouded with fear. For the first time in a long while, she looked like herself. "They've become inseparable," she said, smiling faintly. "Harper calls him her brave hero." "He deserves it," I said, setting my cup down. "They both do." The Vances had been visiting often since Harper's recovery. Her mother, Lila, had told me once in a trembling voice, "You saved our family, Mrs. Moore." But I had corrected her gently. "No," I'd said, "my grandson did. I just listened." Outside, Harper squealed with laughter as Ethan's paper airplane landed in the birdbath. He looked at her, grinning. "It's okay," he said proudly. "I'll make another one." I stepped onto the porch, the sunlight warm on my shoulders. "You two are going to run out of paper at this rate," I teased. Ethan laughed, his smile brighter than I'd seen in years. "That's okay. We'll use Grandma's notes." Rachel chuckled. "Let's not turn my grocery lists into fighter jets." For a while, we just sat there, 3 generations, sharing one quiet morning, the world finally still. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth, and the faint hum of the neighborhood waking up. Life in its simplest form was beginning again. Later that afternoon, Harper's parents stopped by with flowers. Lila hugged me tightly at the door. "We came to say thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not just for saving our daughter, but for reminding people that hope doesn't disappear, even when the world stops believing." Her husband Michael handed Ethan a small model rocket. "For the bravest astronaut we've ever met," he said, smiling. Ethan's eyes lit up. "Thank you, sir." I watched as Harper took Ethan's hand and led him outside to test the rocket. Their laughter trailed behind them, mingling with the rustle of the crepe myrtles that lined the yard. Lila turned to me, her eyes glistening. "You know," she said, quietly, "Harper keeps calling you her second grandma. She said you were the first person who believed her even before she met you." I swallowed hard, emotion rising in my throat. "I'd be honored," I said softly. "Every child deserves more than one person who listens." When they left, the sun had begun to set, streaking the sky with gold and lavender. I stood by the porch railing watching Ethan and Harper chase fireflies across the lawn. Rachel joined me, resting her head against my shoulder. "He's different now," she said. "Happier, lighter." "He's free," I whispered. "He finally believes the monsters are gone." Rachel nodded, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you, Mom. You saved him. You saved all of us." I looked out at the yard, the children running barefoot through the grass, their laughter floating in the air like a promise. "We saved each other," I said. "That's how families survive." After they went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The lamplight was soft, reflecting on the framed photo of Alex that still hung above the mantel. His easy smile watched over the room just as it always had. I picked up my old notebook and began to write. Not a report, not a plea, just a letter. "Dear Alex, I thought losing you was the end of my story, but it was just the beginning of another one about finding the strength to keep our family whole. Ethan's laughter fills this house again, and Rachel's eyes don't carry that old sorrow anymore. I think you'd be proud of them. Of us. The truth nearly broke us, but it also brought us back together. Love, Mom. I folded the letter and placed it on the windowsill where the moonlight touched it gently. Through the glass, the night glowed with peace, the kind that doesn't shout or demand to be seen, but simply is. The next day, the community held a small gathering at the library. They called it a thank you breakfast, but it was more than that. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the woman they'd once called paranoid had been right all along. People brought flowers, pies, and soft words of apology. Nora stood by my side, looking prouder than I'd ever seen her. When the mayor presented me with a certificate of recognition, I almost laughed. "I don't need this," I said into the microphone, my voice trembling slightly. "I only did what any grandmother would do." A few people in the crowd nodded, others wiped their eyes. But I continued, "If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: listen when a child speaks. Even if their story sounds impossible, sometimes the smallest voices are the ones carrying the truth." When the applause came, it was gentle, sincere. And in the front row, Ethan clapped hardest of all. That evening, when the house grew quiet again, he climbed into my lap with Barnaby tucked under his arm. "Grandma," he said sleepily, "am I really a hero?" I smiled and kissed the top of his head. "You're my hero," I said. "You were brave when no one else was." He smiled drowsily. "Then you're my hero too." I held him a little tighter, feeling his heartbeat slow against mine, and whispered, "That's all I've ever wanted." When he finally fell asleep, I looked out the window one last time. The yard was bathed in silver moonlight, the petals of the crepe myrtles glowing faintly. The world was still. Safe. If anyone had told me months ago that this would be the ending, that light would come after all that darkness, I wouldn't have believed it. But as I sat there, the quiet hum of peace wrapping around me, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing, about letting love outlast fear. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, but it's real. If you've made it this far, tell me what you think, what you would have done if you were me. Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have fought for the truth no matter the cost? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe, and stay for the next one. There are more true stories, stories of courage, of family, of love, strong enough to face the dark. Because somewhere another grandmother is still waiting for her moment of truth.